Welcome to the deep dive. So today we're going to do something a little bit different. Instead of just, looking at the nuts and bolts of what to do in a given situation, we're going to step back and, well, I guess as the theme for this deep dive suggests, act as philosophers, right?
Okay.
We're going to be exploring the moral philosophy of F.H. Bradley. And we're drawing on your sources for this, particularly the extensive entry on his work in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yeah.
What's so compelling about Bradley, at least for me, is this central question that he keeps coming back to. And it's a question that I think, really makes you think, which is, what sort of person am I to become?
Right.
It shifts our focus, right, from just following a set of rules to really kind of actively engaging in the creation of our own moral character.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's about, being rather than just doing.
Yeah, that's right. F.H. Bradley, while maybe not as immediately recognizable as some other, big names in moral philosophy, was a really significant figure, especially within the tradition of ethical idealism.
Right.
And as your sources highlight, after a period where his work wasn't as widely discussed, there's been like a real resurgence of interest in his ideas. And I think people are recognizing that, his unique perspective offers valuable insights for ethical discussions that we're having today.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's unpack this idea of acting as philosophers, right, through this lens of Bradley's work.
Okay.
It's not just about, as we said, kind of like figuring out the right action in a particular moment.
Yeah.
It's more about this ongoing project of self-examination.
Right.
So instead of just looking at, a list of do's and don'ts, Bradley's work, particularly his book, Ethical Studies, which I think we'll be talking about quite a bit today, it pushes you to think deeply about the kind of moral self you are in the process of becoming.
Right.
Right. And so, again, it really comes back to this idea of being, not just doing.
Exactly. The central drive of Bradley's ethical thought, as one of your sources phrases it, revolves around this question of good personality. He's less concerned with providing like a definitive rule book for every conceivable action. Although, you could potentially develop a theory of action from his work. His primary focus, and I think the more profound one, is on that question, what sort of person am I to become? And this leads him to develop what's described as a non-instrumental ethical idealism.
Okay, so non-instrumental.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
What does that mean in practical terms for how we approach morality?
Well, it signifies that for Bradley, the ultimate aim of living a moral life isn't to achieve some external outcome, like maximizing happiness or benefiting society, although those things might naturally arise as byproducts.
Right.
The goal in and of itself is the realization of this moral ideal. And at the core of this is the concept of self-realization, developing your moral agency in your personhood for its own intrinsic value.
Okay, so ethical studies. I mentioned it earlier, but this is the key text here, right?
Yes.
To really get to grips with Bradley's thinking on this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Published in 1876 with a later edition in 1927, Ethical Studies is where Bradley really lays out his philosophical framework. And it's a deep exploration into moral selfhood, those moral ideals we're discussing and what fundamentally motivates us ethically. I think it's also such a valuable resource because he critically engages with other dominant ethical theories of his time, like consequentialism, hedonism, and Kantianism, and offers some really, I think, classic arguments against them that still hold water today.
Right, right.
And your sources point out that, maybe his perhaps lesser-known psychological works can offer additional layers of insight into his ethical framework, too.
Yeah, interesting. Now, of course, Bradley didn't develop these ideas in isolation.
Right.
So what were some of the major philosophical influences, according to your sources, that were shaping his thinking?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry you provided highlights the influence of Kant and Hegel, who were both major figures in English moral philosophy the latter part of the 19th century. But it also, interestingly, notes Aristotle as a key influence, particularly on this central idea of self-realization as a form of perfection that's aligned with our human nature.
Okay.
But it's worth noting that, unlike Aristotle, virtue itself wasn't a primary focus for Bradley.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So we've touched on this term ethical idealism.
Yep.
And the Stanford Encyclopedia entry that you provided distinguishes it from other forms of idealism. So can you clarify that distinction a bit more?
Yeah, it's crucial to understand that when we discuss Bradley's idealism, we're talking primarily about the realm of ethics, not metaphysics, in the traditional sense.
Yep.
Bradley was indeed a metaphysical idealist.
Right.
And your source actually notes that there's some ongoing debate about the precise nature of his metaphysical claims. But his ethical idealism specifically focuses on normative ideals, these standards of perfection that guide our moral aspirations.
Okay.
And this is different from metaphysical idealism, which often concerns the nature of ideas as cognitive constructs or the mind dependence of reality.
Right.
As your source from the Stanford Encyclopedia points out, Bradley's ethical idealism, unlike some others, is focused on these guiding principles for moral action.
Right. So it's not about our thoughts shaping the fundamental reality around us,
Right.
but more about, these perfect standards acting as a kind of compass, I guess, for our moral goals and development.
Precisely. Yeah, and then your source makes a really helpful contrast with someone like Nicholas Riescher, who proposed an instrumental ethical idealism, where ideals are valuable as motivators, even if they're ultimately unattainable. For Bradley, however, this moral ideal is the end goal itself, not merely a tool to get us somewhere else, hence the term non-instrumental.
Right. Okay. And your source also mentions Bradley's quite extensive critique of utilitarianism,
Yes.
which was a huge, kind of intellectual battleground, I guess, at the time.
Absolutely. Utilitarianism, with its central focus on maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, was the dominant ethical theory during his intellectual lifetime. And so a substantial portion of ethical studies is dedicated to dissecting the core claims of, key figures like Bentham and Mill, and even, the more nuanced defenses put forth by Henry Sidgwick.
Right.
And, while these critiques were very influential historically and really helped to shape the landscape of ethical thought, your source does rightly point out that sometimes overemphasizing them can lead us to overlook Bradley's central and more constructive focus, which is that process of moral self-realization.
Okay, so now we're getting to a phrase that I've often heard associated with Bradley,
Yeah.
and that is my station and its duties. And the Stanford Encyclopedia entry suggests that this has been something of a misunderstanding, or an oversimplification at least, of his broader ethical framework.
Right.
So what's the more nuanced understanding that you can share about this?
That's a really important clarification. For a long time, the common understanding, or I guess misunderstanding, was that Bradley's ethics could be boiled down to just fulfilling the obligations that are attached to your various social roles.
Right.
However, your source details how, more recent scholarship has challenged this reductionist view and has demonstrated that it doesn't capture the richness and complexity of his thought. There is still some lingering confusion, though, about, moral significance he does give to following social expectations.
So it's not as simple as just doing what society tells you to do and calling it moral.
Not at all. Your source breaks down the phrase my station and its duties into, I think it's 3 different interpretations. As it appears in ethical studies, there's Hegel's normative thesis, then the more straightforward idea of positional duties, and then finally Bradley's own revised and I think more critical view,
Okay.
where he ultimately argues that our social obligations only become genuinely moral obligations when they can be justified from what he calls an ideal point of view. He fundamentally rejects the idea that morality can be reduced to just prevailing social requirements. And as your source indicates, more recent scholarly attention has shifted towards Essay 6 of Ethical Studies, the ideal morality, which really delves into the core of his own ethical vision beyond that potentially misleading phrase.
Right. And you keep mentioning this ideal point of view.
Yeah.
It sounds absolutely crucial to understanding kind of the core of Bradley's ethical framework.
It's central, yeah. And it's deeply intertwined with this concept of the moral ideal, which we'll get to, I think, in a little bit.
Okay.
But for now, understand that it's about evaluating not only, your individual actions, but also those broader social norms against a standard of perfection,
Right.
rather than just accepting them as they are presented to you.
Okay, so let's turn our attention now to this concept of the moral self,
Okay.
which your source emphasizes as so important within Bradley's ethics, particularly as kind of like a foundational element for understanding moral responsibility.
Yeah.
So even though, maybe his later metaphysical work might have presented a different view of the self,
Right.
within ethical studies, it's treated as a real and necessary construct.
Yeah.
So why is this distinction so important?
It's vital because, as your source explains, for Bradley, the very possibility of ethics, of moral life, hinges on the concept of a self. Even from a purely metaphysical standpoint, it might be considered, a mental construct. It's nonetheless necessary for our practical moral reasoning.
Okay.
And he begins his analysis by examining how ordinary people like you and me understand moral responsibility.
Right.
We intuitively recognize that for someone to be held accountable for an action, that person needs to be the same individual who performed the act.
Right.
The act must genuinely be their own,
Right.
not coerced.
Yeah.
And they must have possessed some level of understanding regarding its moral quality.
Right. Right.
And this aligns quite closely with, Aristotelian ideas of agency, right?
Right.
Where the action originates from within the person. It's free from external compulsion. And it's accompanied by a degree of awareness.
So when someone says something like, I wasn't myself, or I didn't really mean to do that,
Right.
you know, those are often seen as mitigating circumstances because they challenge this very sense of a coherent and responsible self.
Exactly. And Bradley proceeds to contrast this, everyday understanding
Right.
with the more formal philosophical theories of determinism and indeterminism.
Okay.
And he argues that, both of these, in their own ways, ultimately fail to adequately account for the moral self as we intuitively understand it. Determinism, by suggesting that all of our actions are causally predetermined, undermines the agent's genuine ability to act based on reasons.
Right.
It erodes their autonomy. Indeterminism, on the other hand, by claiming that our actions are essentially determined by nothing at all, makes it impossible to reasonably predict someone's behavior based on their moral character, which is something that we often expect and even morally require in our interactions with others.
Right. So if neither of those philosophical frameworks quite works,
Yeah,
where does Bradley go from there?
right.
And I think this is where the concept of self-realization comes back into the picture for us.
Precisely. For Bradley, the fundamental ethical question becomes, what kind of self should one strive to realize in their moral life? And this leads directly to his central and defining idea of moral life as a process of self-realization, a creative, goal-oriented, and self-assertive process of developing and shaping, the moral dimensions of the self.
And this self-realization isn't just about, fulfilling any passing whim or desire, is it? Because your source actually connects it to Kant's principle of universalizability.
Yes.
So how does that connection work for Bradley?
Self-realization, in its broader ethical sense, provides a way of making Kant's somewhat abstract principle of universalizability more concrete, more applicable in an individual's actual life.
Okay.
It's not simply about mandating that everyone must perform the exact same actions in every situation,
Right.
but rather about recognizing that if someone else were in your precise moral circumstances, the same underlying moral reasons would apply to their actions. And this inherently presupposes a distinction between what Bradley terms the moral self, which is the subject of moral evaluation, and potentially universalizable in its rational capacities, and my moral self, which is always situated within the specific and unique context of my individual life. While our specific life experiences and situations will invariably differ, the fundamental reasons why both of us can be considered moral selves, capable of rational deliberation and moral action, remain the same.
So self-realization is essentially like the ongoing process of taking that somewhat abstract ideal of a universal moral self and actually like living it out through the concrete specifics of our own individual lives and choices.
Exactly. Yeah, it's about how we bridge that gap, between that abstract moral principle and having a real lived moral self.
Yeah.
And I think, as your source rightly highlights, there's a deep, reciprocal link between our actions and the kind of person we are continually becoming.
Right.
As moral agents, we are constantly creating and recreating ourselves
Right.
through the choices we make and the actions we take.
Now, the primary driving force behind this process of self-realization, according to Bradley, is desire.
Yeah.
Which might sound a little, simplistic on the surface, right?
Yeah.
So how does he understand the concept of desire in this more kind of nuanced ethical context?
Bradley offers a fairly sophisticated view of desire, carefully distinguishing it from mere, sensations of pain and pleasure. He employs a really interesting metaphor of direction of fit, contrasting desire with belief.
Okay.
With our beliefs, our minds strive to accurately reflect the world as it is.
Right.
But with our desires, we actively seek to make the world conform to our minds,
Okay.
or to bridge that gap between our actual self and our envisioned ideal self. And he introduces the concept of the ideal object of desire, which is essentially a mental representation of a better state of affairs that doesn't yet exist in our current reality.
So that perceived gap, right, between how we currently are and how we ideally envision ourselves to be creates a kind of psychological tension,
Right.
right? A felt contradiction.
Wow.
That serves as the primary motivating force for us to, to change and to strive for that ideal.
Precisely. That inherent psychological tension is absolutely key. But then we encounter this, seemingly paradoxical claim by Bradley that nothing is desired except that which is identified with ourselves.
Right.
And your source helpfully clarifies that this isn't, a statement of blatant narcissism. Instead, it speaks to the deeply personal way in which our desires are ultimately connected to our fundamental personal aspirations and commitments. Think about Muirhead's idea, which your source mentions,
Mm.
that the content of any desire inherently contains a predicate of the desired self.
Okay.
It's not simply, I want that,
Right.
but implicitly, I want myself to be the kind of person who possesses that or who's capable of achieving that. So even if I deeply desire something for someone else, like, the well-being of my child,
Right.
that desire is still fundamentally tied to my own, self-conception as a good parent.
Mhm.
Exactly. It becomes integrated into your personal set of commitments. It becomes part of who you aspire to be. Your source also brings in Mackenzie's, insightful concept of desire as essentially expressing one's individual point of view on the world.
Right.
And Bradley's notion of the whole of ends, which can be understood as our, interconnected network of life goals or our ideal desire sets.
Right.
Ultimately, Bradley argues that our desires reveal what we fundamentally identify with.
Right.
And the ongoing process of self-realization is the unavoidable outcome of the choices we make based on those desires. We are always in the process of becoming a particular kind of person
Right.
through what we consistently desire and act upon.
Okay. So we have this continuous drive towards self-realization that's fueled by our desires
Yeah.
and, the inherent tension between our current and ideal selves. But how do we ensure that we're actually striving towards a moral ideal?
Right.
Right. How do we maintain integrity and direction in this complex process?
This is a crucial question, and your source points to Bradley's critique of Mill's qualitative hedonism as a way to frame this challenge.
Huh?
Bradley famously questioned the objective basis for Mill's attempt to distinguish between higher and lower pleasures. His alternative approach is to emphasize the importance of creating a meaningful life that's directed by a set of non-contradictory commitments that form a coherent, unified narrative, about who we are as a person. Integrity, in this context, becomes a matter of aligning our actions with these deeply held commitments.
So it's fundamentally about striving to live a life that makes sense internally,
Yeah.
right? Where our actions and our core values are, consistent.
Yeah.
And mutually reinforcing.
Yeah, and your source mentions this idea of a standing will and, the role of habitual desires as important mechanisms for achieving this kind of internal unity. However, Bradley's also aware that mere internal consistency isn't enough to guarantee moral goodness.
Right.
Someone could be perfectly consistent in their pursuit of, entirely immoral goals. This is where the concept of the moral ideal becomes essential.
Okay.
It serves as the ultimate standard for achieving moral self-realization.
Right. And this moral ideal isn't, some abstract and unattainable concept, is it?
No.
Your source describes it as a concrete universal. So what does that actually mean?
It's not intended to be an abstract theoretical construct,
Sure.
but rather an instantiated unity that is embedded in a person's actual lived experience, their desires, their beliefs, commitments, and actions.
Okay.
Think of it, perhaps most helpfully, as your own personal moral ideal.
Right.
The evolving ideal of your own personhood,
Right.
which is shaped by the specific circumstances and relationships that define your life. Your source outlines, I think, 3 broad categories of commitments that contribute to the content of this ideal self. Obligations to other people, which is a broader and more nuanced understanding of my station and its duties.
Right.
Obligations to humanity as a whole.
Right.
And fundamental commitments to values like truth and beauty.
Right.
The moral ideal then functions as a normative force, a guide for our personalized journey of self-realization.
So it's more like a guiding framework rather than a rigid set of rules carved in stone.
Yeah.
It helps us to determine the kind of person we ought to strive to become, taking into account our own unique circumstances and relationships with others,
Yeah,
while still aiming for something that is ultimately good.
precisely. It provides the direction, sets the standard, but the individual moral agent retains the responsibility for interpreting and applying it.
Right, right. Your source also touches on Bradley's account of moral development.
Yes.
So how does he envision us actually evolving into moral beings?
His account, which shows the influence of this idea of internalizing social scripts through play, suggests that we gradually develop moral consciousness over time.
Uh,
Initially, as children, our experiences of pleasure and pain, become associated with objects and with the approval or disapproval of others around us.
Yep.
And over time, we learn the language of morality and begin to internalize these moral perspectives. While pleasure and pain play a role in this early development, they're not seen as the ultimate goal of morality, but rather as responses to either realizing or failing to realize a more superior conception of the self. Your source also emphasizes that there's this internal struggle, right,
right.
between what we might perceive as our good and bad tendencies and moral action. This constant effort of aligning ourselves with our evolving moral ideal. Ultimately, self-realization is not a static endpoint,
Right.
but rather a continuous and dynamic process, a
Yeah.
never-ending attempt to approximate our own moral ideal.
So we're always a work in progress.
Yeah.
Never fully there in
Right.
terms of achieving some, perfect moral completion.
That's a key takeaway from Bradley. Self-realization is conceived as this lifelong journey of, growth and refinement.
Right. Okay. And finally, your source clarifies these important limits of morality for Bradley, particularly in distinguishing it from the realms of religion
Right.
and, the broader social and political spheres.
Yeah,
So this is an important distinction to make, I think, to avoid some common misunderstandings of his work.
absolutely. Bradley sees morality as fundamentally presupposing, this gap or this tension between our current reality and our envisioned ideal.
Okay.
Our moral actions are directed toward bridging that perceived gap.
Right.
However, in religious consciousness, that very gap is believed to be already overcome, transcended in the absolute.
Okay.
So the primary motivation shifts from, moral striving to religious faith and devotion.
Right.
He also makes a crucial point that, moral obligation isn't simply identical to social requirements or expectations.
Right.
We always need to have independent and well-reasoned justifications for evaluating the morality of prevailing social norms. Just because a particular society expects something of you doesn't automatically render it morally right or obligatory.
Right, right. So in essence, acting as philosophers, through this lens of Bradley's work really means engaging in this continuous and, kind of deep internal project of self-realization.
Yeah.
It's guided by our own, kind of personalized yet fundamentally universalizable moral ideal.
Right.
And it involves a constant striving, right,
Yeah.
to bridge the inherent gap between who we currently are and who we believe we ought to become,
Yeah.
all while maintaining, kind of a critical and reflective perspective on the world around us.
That's a remarkably insightful summary. It captures the dynamic and ongoing nature of Bradley's ethical vision.
Well, this has been a really illuminating deep dive into the moral philosophy of F.H. Bradley. I think it's been fascinating to see how he kind of redirects our focus from, just a mere adherence to external rules towards this much more profound internal work, right?
Yeah.
Of actively shaping our own character. For me, it definitely sparks that aha moment of recognizing that the journey of becoming a good person is fundamentally an internal project of self-discovery and self-creation.
Indeed. Leaves you with a bit to consider, doesn't it?
It does. So for our final provocative thought today, consider this. Given Bradley's emphasis on this, deeply internal struggle,
Yeah.
that's inherent in this process of self-realization. How might his philosophical framework, uniquely inform our understanding of moral education? Or maybe even the subtle, the powerful role that societal influences play in shaping our individual character over time?
Right.
Right? Is this ongoing journey of becoming a good person primarily a solitary and introspective endeavor? Or does the specific station we find ourselves in, though not in that simplistic way that we talked about earlier, still play a crucial and perhaps underappreciated role in this process of moral development? It's definitely something for you to continue mulling over. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.